Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
George Osborne unveiled a budget which he hoped would satisfy the Tory faithful, generate a feel-good factor in the run-up to the EU referendum and enhance his own leadership prospects in the process. That strategy started to come off the rails within 24 hours as the Chancellor faced Tory revolts on 4 fronts. And it was blown to smithereens on Friday night when Welfare Secretary Ian Duncan-Smith resigned over savings to disability payments. This morning, open warfare is breaking out across the Tory party. We'll be devoting the next half hour to this story with analysis and comment from Nick, Isabel and Janan and interviews with the Shadow Work and Pension Secretary Owen Smith, the Conservative backbencher Heidi Allen and the head of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, Paul Johnson. But first, here's our Giles reporting on the very public falling out at the very top of David Cameron's government.
When a Chancellor gets badly hurt in an attack from his own side, we shouldn't be surprised where it came from. It's always the quiet one. Ian Duncan-Smith and George Osborne were never bosom buddies, and they're on the opposite sides of the EU referendum divide. But for nearly 6 years, they've worked together in government delivering welfare reform and savings. Last July, when the Chancellor announced a living wage,
those currently on the minimum wage will see their pay rise by over a third this Parliament.
It had no bigger fan. And whilst in polling there was popular support for balancing the books and reforming welfare, there was also angry protest, especially from disabled people who passionately believed they'd been targeted unfairly and disproportionately. The deepest wound a Work and Pension Secretary could inflict on his own government would be to say that they had a point. And now he has. And it was never meant to be like this. On Wednesday we were touted a budget that would be dull, not much wriggle room or rabbits, sugared or otherwise. Nonetheless, the Chancellor and wannabe PM was bullish.
The richest 1% paid 28% of all income tax revenue, a higher proportion than in any single year of the last Labour government. Proof that we are all in this together.
But not so for many disabled people and enough Tory MPs when later he said this.
On welfare, last week my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, set out changes that will ensure that within the rising disability budget, support is better targeted at those who need it most.
It was a confirmation of changes that just 48 hours later would see a resignation letter from the man the Chancellor was referring to, questioning if enough has been done to ensure we are all in this together. These were changes to personal independence payments that had replaced disability living allowance and that would make it more likely large numbers of recipients got less money, in some cases much less, in future. Something he regarded as a compromise too far. According to Mr. Duncan-Smith, the changes had been demanded because too much emphasis on money-saving exercises and that his welfare to work reforms could not be repeatedly salami-sliced. By this weekend, the government's unofficial political paramedic was dispatched to patch up the internal wounds Mr. Duncan-Smith's literary cuts had inflicted.
The budget proposals were endorsed by the whole Cabinet on Wednesday morning before the Chancellor presented them to Parliament, and he was obviously part of that process. These proposals came from his department.
And the PM's response to the letter stressed, that is why we collectively agreed, you, Number 10 and the Treasury, proposals which you and your department then announced a week ago. In the hours after the budget, amid angry rumblings from the backbenches, suddenly the government were describing an announced policy as
something that has been put forward, there has been a review, there has been a suggestion.
And the suggestion the next day from the PM hinted nothing was fixed.
We're going to discuss what we put forward with the disability charities and others, as the Chancellor said today, and make sure that we get this right. It's important. It is important that this increase in money goes to the people who need it the most.
The problem is the internal party concerns were that it looked like money was going to those that didn't need it most.
The headline rate of capital gains tax currently stands at 28%. Today I'm cutting it to 20%. And I'm cutting the capital gains tax paid by basic rate taxpayers from 18% to just 10%.
Ian Duncan Smith said the disability reforms couldn't be defended within a budget that benefits higher earning taxpayers. I'm told this was the most toxic aspect for a large number of Tory MPs, and that he was not the only Conservative in government who'd considered resignation over this. But not everyone was sorry to see him go.
The problems have been at the heart of the DWP. I do not see eye to eye with the Treasury. It's very, very well known. I'm not the Chancellor's biggest supporter, shall we say, but the reality is that in all the experiences that I've had, the problems have been with an evangelical point of view, aggressive reforms that have consistently failed disabled people designed in the DWP.
As Stephen Crabb takes on work and pensions, Mr Duncan Smith is out of a job. But clearly the quiet man reflected that if you're going to turn up the volume at all, best rattle the windows of Downing Street.
Charles Donut reporting. A war of words has now broken out in Ian Duncan Smith's old department, with one junior minister accusing him of shocking behaviour, but three other ministers rounding on her and coming to IDS's defence. Mr Duncan Smith gave his first post-resignation interview to Andrew Marr. Anybody who thinks this is a here today, gone tomorrow resignation should watch this.
I am genuinely frustrated. I have no personal ambitions, Andrew. I have absolutely no personal ambitions. If I never go back into government again, then I will not cry about that. That is not my ambition. I only came into this government, and let me be clear about this, I came into this government because I cared about welfare reform. I'd spent 8 years with the Centre for Social Justice, which I set up, talking to charities and small community groups, trying to figure out why certain communities were so badly off and how could we get them back to work and how could we solve their problems. So everything that I've done has been driven by my desire to improve the quality of life for the worst off. We can debate my policies, we can argue about them, but my motivation has always been about that. And my motive now, without any question in my mind, is that I am concerned that this government that I want to succeed is actually not able to do the kind of things that it should, because it has become too focused on narrowly getting the deficit down without being able to say where that should fall, other than simply on those who I think progressively can less afford to have that fall on them.
Ian Duncan Smith. Minutes later, the Energy Secretary, Amber Rudd, popped up to attack her former Cabinet colleague, saying she resents Mr Duncan Smith's high moral tone.
Well, I have to say, I do remain a bit perplexed about it. The whole series of events that led up to it seemed to indicate that he was making progress. He wrote this Dear Colleague letter on Thursday night, setting out why he was doing it and why we should all support it. And then there was the government change of heart on it. So I know I don't really understand it. I do remain perplexed about it. But above all, I'm pretty disappointed. I mean, this is a man who I sat at Cabinet with for nearly a year. I mean, he was obviously a Cabinet Minister for 6 years, but I've sat at Cabinet with him every week for the past year. I do respect him, and so to suddenly launch this bombshell on the rest of us in a way that is difficult for us all to understand is just really disappointing.
So, Isabel, the Tory party now in open warfare, and I would suggest, given the backdrop of the referendum, not easily quelled.
Well, if Amber Rudd is perplexed about why Ian Duncan Smith did this, I would say that that's a dereliction of duty on her part to understand what has really been going on in her own administration. In a way, there's nothing that sudden about this for Ian Duncan Smith. It's been brewing for a very long time. She should know that. He has been wrestling for a long time over whether he can do better staying where he is, operating within the very difficult constraints that the Treasury has imposed on him, or whether actually he's better off out saying what he really thinks. And that is what tipped him over the edge in the last few days. Now, the Downing Street strategy is clearly to paint Ian Duncan Smith as a kind of, you know, head-banging Eurosceptic and try to pretend that this is all about the EU referendum. I don't think that anyone who watched Ian Duncan Smith this morning giving that very powerful interview to Andrew Marr could really doubt that what this is about is Ian Duncan Smith's real desire to do the right thing by the disadvantaged. The rest is just noises off.
Well, when you look at some of these clips, he comes out against the welfare cap. It's too arbitrary. He says that what they're doing is damaging the poor and giving tax rises to the rich. And I could go through it. I mean, if you were sitting in the Labour Party right now, you'll be cutting up that interview and pouring it out at every opportunity. This story will go on and on and on.
No, it will, and I mean, I agree with Isabel. I mean, I interviewed Ian Duncan Smith, I think about a month or 2 months after the 2010 election with my colleague Patrick Winter, and he said, if George Osborne wants me to be a cheese parer, if he just wants me to do arbitrary cuts, I will be out. I'm not going to do that. And Isabel says he has been wrestling for 6 years with this one, because he came into this after that great visit to the Easter House estate in Glasgow. When he was Tory leader, he binned Europe and talked about championing the vulnerable, and he came to it with a mission to try increase incentives for the low paid to come back to work. His view is, for George Osborne, it's just the bottom line. How much can I cut? But you are right, it's not going to go away. And you've got the extraordinary spectacle today of 3 ministers in his former department, Priti Patel, Justin Tomlinson and Shailesh Vara, putting out statements in support of Ian Duncan Smith, and Ross Altman, who's the pensions minister, coming out and basically delivering a script, which is the Downing Street script, saying that this is about Europe, even though there's not a word about Europe in Ian Duncan Smith's statement. Ross Altman, who was very unhappy with Downing Street and the Treasury on their proposed pensions changes, now coming out and delivering the script that Downing Street want. That is a bit of a mess, and what it shows is that the discipline, the normal discipline you'd expect in government, really is under challenge because of the referendum.
It's over for George Osborne, isn't it?
It's not as if it was on even before the budget. You'd had the reversal on tax credits last summer, a bit of a reversal on pension reforms earlier this year, and now this. You cannot deliver a budget on a Wednesday which then has to be spun as just a proposition by Thursday evening, and then by Friday evening provokes a senior cabinet colleague resignation. I think it's very bad for him. I don't quite buy the idea that it's catastrophic for the government in the long term. Ultimately, Ian Duncan Smith has left the government. McCartney has not left the Beatles. A government should be able to withstand 10 months after a general election mandate the loss of a cabinet member.
But it could start to get, in the context of them all going their Fitzperius ways during the EU referendum, it could just get worse.
Well, they need this referendum out of the way as quickly as possible. It's still 3 months away. They need not only the referendum out of the way, but a fairly comfortable victory, I would suggest, for the Remain side, David Cameron's side, to have any chance at all of putting a lid on all this. I just think in 4 years' time, will it determine a general election? No. Will it determine George Osborne's leadership chances? Quite probably.
I'm not quite sure how the Prime Minister puts this back together again, especially if it is a bitter EU referendum campaign and if the result is close. It may not be just Mr Osborne's future on the line, it could be the Prime Minister's.
I think that's a really important point, because the Chancellor's fate is inextricably tied to the Prime Minister. Those two are the project. They have worked together to make the Conservatives electable again, and if George Osborne goes down, well, Cameron's position is also in doubt. I'm not for a minute suggesting we're there at this point, but I think it's incredibly destabilising.
And don't forget, Cameron has never been master of these events. He didn't want to have this referendum in the first place. He was bounced into it. Well, and as ever, he ain't controlling it.
And as we know, these things have a life of their own, so it should keep us busy.
I've been getting away with it.